Chapter 7, Section 2. Most high school students are not old enough to vote. In some parts of the country, though, high school students can serve on local election boards, first in Hawaii and in Oregon, now in several states. 16 and 17-year-olds can become full-fledged members on the panels and administer local levels. We hold more elections in this country, and we vote more often than most people realize. Indeed, Sundays and holidays are about the only days of the year in which people do not go to the polls somewhere in the United States. We also elect far more office holders than most people realize. In fact, more than 500,000 of them, more than in any other country in the world. The administration of elections. Democratic government cannot possibly hope to succeed unless its elections are free, honest, and accurately reported. Many people see the details of the election process as much too complicated, too legalistic, too dry, and boring to worry about. Those who do really miss the vital part of those details play in making democracy work. How something can be done very often shapes what is in fact done, and that fact is true to politics as it is in all areas of human concern. Extent of local federal control. Nearly all elections in the United States are held to choose the more than 500,000 persons who hold elective office in the more than 89,000 units of government at the state and local levels. It is quite understandable, then, that most election law in the United States is state, not federal law. Even so, a body of federal election law does exist. The Constitution gives Congress the power to fix the times, place, and manner of holding elections of members of Congress. Congress also has the power to set the time for choosing presidential electors, to set the date for casting the electoral votes, and to regulate other aspects of the presidential election process. Congress has set the date for holding congressional elections as the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November of every even-numbered year. It is set the same day every fourth year for the presidential election. Thus, an off-year round of congressional contest was scheduled for November 2, 2010, followed by a presidential election on November 6, 2012. Congress has required the use of secret ballots and allowed the use of voting machines and similar devices in federal elections. It has also acted to protect the right to vote, as you saw in Chapter 6. Congress also has prohibited various corrupt practices and regulates the financing of campaigns for federal office, as you'll see in the pages ahead. Congress expanded the body of federal election law with the passage of the Help America Vote Act of 2002. That law came in response to the many ballot and voter registration problems that plagued several states in the presidential election in 2000. A ballot is the medium by which a voter registers a choice in an election. In its major provisions, the law requires the states to 1. Replace all of their level-operated and punch card voting devices by 2006, a deadline that in fact most states failed to meet. 2. Upgrade their administration of elections, especially through the better training of local election officials and of those more than 2 million, mostly low-paid workers and volunteers who work in precinct polling places on Election Day. 3. Centralize and computerize their voter registration systems to facilitate the identification of qualified voters on Election Day and so minimize fraudulent voting. 4. Provide for provisional voting, so as a person whose eligibility to vote has been challenged can nonetheless cast a ballot that will be counted if it later found that he or she is in fact qualified to vote. State law deals with all other matters related to national elections, with all the details of state and local elections as well. Election Day. Most states hold their elections to fill state offices on the same day Congress has set for national elections. In November of every even-numbered year, the Tuesday after the first Monday formula prevents elections from falling on one Sunday to maintain the principle of separation of church and state, and to the first day of the month, which is often payday and therefore peculiarly subject to campaign pressures. Some states do fix other dates for some offices, however. Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Virginia elect the governor, other executive officers, and state legislators in November of odd-numbered years. In Kentucky, the governor and other executive offices are chosen in odd-numbered years, but legislators are elected in even-numbered years. City, county, and other local election dates vary from state to state. When those elections are not held in November, they generally take place in the spring. Early voting. Millions of Americans cast their ballots before Election Day. Indeed, some 32 million did so in 2008. Many of them did so by absentee voting, a process by which they could vote without going to their polling places on Election Day. Congress was responsible for the first instance of absentee voting in the midst of the Civil War. It provided for the casting of absentee ballots by federal troops in the elections of 1864. Over the years, every state has made at least some provision for the process. Now, almost everywhere voters can apply for an absentee ballot some weeks before an election. They mark those ballots and return them to the local election office, usually by mail, in a sealed envelope and before Election Day. State absentee voting was originally intended to serve a relatively small group of voters, especially the ill or disabled and those who expected to be away from home on Election Day. Most states have broadened their laws over recent years, however, to the point where in most of them, any qualified voter can cast an absentee ballot simply because he or she wants to vote that way. 2/3 of the states have now formalized early voting. They allow any voters who choose to do so to cast their ballots at any time over a period of several days before an election, not as an absentee ballot, but as though they were voting on Election Day itself. Indeed, in many places, Election Day is now just the final on which votes can be cast. The coattail effect. The coattail effect occurs when a strong candidate running for an office at the top of the ballot helps attract voters to other candidates on the party's ticket. In effect, the lesser-known office seeker rides the coattails of the more prestigious personality. For example, a Franklin Roosevelt, a Ronald Reagan, or a Barack Obama. The coattail effect is usually most apparent in presidential elections. However, an unpopular candidate for senator or governor can have the same kind of pulling power in state and local elections. A reverse coattail effect can occur too. This happens when a candidate for some major office is less than popular with many voters. For example, Barry Goldwater as a Republican presidential nominee in 1964 and George McGovern for the Democrats in 1972. President Jimmy Carter's coattails were also in the reverse variety in 1980. Some have long argued that all state and local elections should be held on dates other than those set for federal elections. This, they say, would help voters pay more attention to state and local candidates and issues and lessen the coattail effect a presidential candidate can have. Precincts and polling places. A precinct is a voting district. Precincts are the smallest geographic units for the conduct of elections. State law regularly restricts their size, generally to an area with no more than 500 to 1,000 or so qualified voters. A polling place, the place where the voters who live in a precinct actually vote, is located somewhere in or near each precinct. A precinct election board supervises the polling place and the voting process in each precinct. Typically, the county clerk or county board of elections draws precinct lines, fixes the location of each polling place, and picks the members of the precinct boards. The precinct board opens and closes the polls at the times set by state law. In most states, the polls are open from 7 or 8 a.m. to 7 or 8 p.m. The precinct election must also see that the ballots and the ballot boxes or voting devices are available. It must make certain that only qualified voters can cast ballots in the precinct. Often the board also counts the votes cast in the precinct and then sends the results to the proper place, usually the county clerk or county board of elections. Poll watchers, one from each party, are allowed to each polling place. They may challenge any person they believe is not qualified to vote, check to be sure that their own party supporters do vote, and monitor the whole process, including the counting of the ballots. Casting the ballot. A ballot can take a number of different forms, ranging from a piece of paper to optional scanners and touchscreens. Whatever its form, however, it is clearly important and sensitive part of the election process. Each state now provides for a secret ballot. That is, state law requires that ballots be cast in such a manner that others cannot know how a person has voted. Voting was a quiet public process through many of the nation's early history. Paper ballots were used in some colonial elections, but voting was more commonly by voice. Voters simply stated their choice in public to an election board, with suffrage limited to the privileged few. Many people defended oral voting as the only manly way in which to participate. Whatever the merits of that view, the expansion of electorate brought with it a marked increase in intimidation, vote buying, and other corruptions of the voting process. Paper ballots were in general use by the mid-1800s. The first ones were unofficial slips of paper that voters prepared themselves and dropped in the ballot box. Soon, candidates and parties began to prepare ballots and hand them to voters to cast, sometimes paying them to do so. Those party ballots were often printed on distinctly distinctively colored paper, and anyone watching could tell for whom voters were voting. Political machines, local party organizations capable of mobilizing or manufacturing large numbers of votes on behalf of candidates for public office, flourished in many places in the later 1800s. They fought all attempts to make voting a more dependably fair and honest process. The political corruption of the post-Civil War years brought widespread demand for ballot reforms. The Australian ballot. A new voting arrangement was devised in Australia. It was first used in an election in Victoria in 1856. Its successors were led to its use in other countries. By 1900, nearly all of the states were using it, and it remains the basic form of the ballot in this country today. The Australian ballot has 4 essential features. 1 is printed at public expense, 2 lists the names of all candidates in an election, 3 is given out only at the polls, 1 to each qualified voter, and 4 can be marked in secret. Two basic forms of the Australian ballot shown on page 197 has been used in this country over the past century. Most states now use the office group ballot. Only a handful of them rely on the party column ballot. Sample ballots. Sample ballots, clearly marked as such, are available in most states before an election. In some states, they are mailed to all voters, and they appear in most newspapers and on the internet. They cannot be cast, but they can help voters prepare for an election. First in Oregon, 1907, and now in several states, an official voters pamphlet is mailed to voters before every election. It lists all candidates and measures that will appear on the ballot. In Oregon, each candidate is allowed space to present his or her qualifications and positions on the issues. Supporters and opponents of ballot measures are allowed space to present their arguments as well. Bedsheet ballots. The ballot as a typical American election is lengthy, often and aptly called a bedsheet ballot. It frequently lists so many offices and candidates and ballot measures that even the most well-informed voters have a difficult time marking it intelligently. The long ballot came to American politics in the era of Jacksonian bureaucracy in the 1830s. Many held the view at the time that the greater number of elective offices, the more democratic the governmental system. That idea remains widely accepted today. Generally, the longest ballots are found at the local level, especially among the nation's 3,000-odd counties. The list of elected offices is likely to include several commissioners, a clerk, a sheriff, 1 or more judges, a prosecutor, coroner, treasurer, assessor, surveyor, school superintendent, engineer, sanitarian, and even proverbial dog catcher. Critics of the bedsheet ballot reject the notion that more people you elect, the more democratic the system. Instead, they say the fewer the offices voters have to fill, the better they can know the candidates and their qualifications. Those critics often point to the factor of ballot fatigue, that is, to the drop-off in voting that can run as high as 20 to 30% at or near the bottom of the typical lengthy ballot. There seems little, if any, good reason to elect such local officials as clerks, coroners, surveyors, and engineers. Their jobs do not carry basic policy-making responsibilities. Rather, they carry out policies made by others. Many believe that to shorten the ballot and promote good government, the rules should be elect those who make public policies, appoint those whose basic job it is to administer those policies. Automated voting. Well, over half of the voters now cast in national elections are cast in some type of voting machine and increasingly on some type of electronic voting device. Thomas Edison patented the first voting machine, the first mechanical device for the casting and counting of votes. In 1868, and the Myers automatic booth was first used in public election on Lockport, New York in 1892. The use of similar but much improved devices soon spread to polling places across the country. For the better part of a century, most voting machines were lever-operated and quite cumbersome. Voters had to pull various levers in order to cast their ballots. One lever to open and unlock the machine, others to indicate their choice of candidates, and yet another to close the lock machine and record their votes. Those lever-operated machines did speed up the voting process, and they reduced booth fraud and counting errors. The machines were quite expensive, however, and they also posed major storage and transport problems from one election to the next. Electronic vote counting. Electronic data processing, EDP, techniques were first applied to the voting process in the 1960s. California and Oregon led the way, and EDP is now a vital part of the process in most states. For some years, the most widely used adoptions of EDP involved punch card ballots counted by computers, But punch card ballots often produce problems, most frequently because voters failed to make clean punches. Their incomplete perforations left hanging chads that made the cards difficult or impossible for computers to read. Punch card ballots played a major role in the disputed presidential election vote count in Florida in 2000, and that fiasco led to the passage of the Help America Vote Act of 2002. As we noted on page 194, that law required the elimination of all punch card voting devices and all lever-operated voting machines as well. Most states have turned to two other EDP-based voting systems. One of them involves the same optical scanning technology used to grade the standardized tests students take in school. Voters mark their ballots by filling in circles, ovals, or rectangles, or by completing arrows. A computer scans the marked ballots, counting and records the voter's cast. The other system utilizes direct response electronic voting machines, DREs. Those machines are like ATMs or cash machines. Voters make their choice on most models by touching the screen, or on some by pushing buttons. Their votes are recorded electronically. DREs have proved troublesome in many places. Some models have malfunction, and some do not provide a paper record of voters' choices. Many computer scientists insist that DREs can be easily compromised by hackers. Several states abandoned them for 2008. They turned instead to optical scanning systems or went back to hand-counted paper ballots. Vote-by-mail elections. A number of states now conduct at least some of their elections by mail. Voters receive a ballot in the mail, mark them, and mail the ballots back to election officials. The first election of such election was held in Monterey County, California in 1977, and the first large-scale use of mail-in ballots took place in San Diego in 1981. To this point, the most vote-by-mail elections have been confined to the local level and to voting on city or county measures, not on candidates for local offices. But recall, as we noted a few pages ago, vote-by-mail is an integral part of the absentee voting process. The voting by absentee ballot is becoming an increasingly common practice in many places. In fact, one state, Oregon, now holds all of its elections by mail and has done so since 1998. That state held the first ever all-mail primary election and then their first all-mail general election, including the presidential election in 2000. Voting by mail has stirred controversy, of course. Critics fear that the process threatens the secret ballot principle. They worry about fraud, especially the possibility that some voters may be subjected to undue pressures when they mark their ballots at home or any other place other than a secure voting booth. Supporters, on the other hand, say that more than 10 years of voting by mail in Oregon indicates that the process can be as fraud-proof as any other method of voting. They also make this point: the mail-in process increases voter participation in elections and at the same time reduces the cost of conducting them. Online voting. Online voting, casting ballots via the internet, has attracted considerable attention and some support in recent years. While will e-voting become widespread, even commonplace at some precinct? As some predict, obviously only time will tell. Online voting is not entirely new phenomena. The first e-vote was cast in November 1997. Election officials in Harris County, Texas, allowed astronaut David Wolf to vote in Houston's city election by email from the space station Mir. The first public election in which some votes were cast by computer was held in 2000, Arizona's Democratic presidential primary. The Defense Department enabled 84 members of the military stationed abroad to vote electronically in the general election that year, but chose not to repeat the program because of worries about ballot security. In 2008, Arizona became the first state to allow registered voters living abroad, both civilian and military, to vote early and online. Several thousand Arizonians did so. A number of public officials and private companies promote online voting. They claim that it will make participation much more convenient, increasing voter turnout and reduce election costs. Many skeptics believe that the electronic infrastructure is not ready for e-voting. Some fear digital disaster: jammed phone lines, blocked access, hackers, viruses, denial of service attacks, fraudulent vote counts, and violations of voter secrecy. Critics also point out that because not everyone can afford home computers, online voting could undermine the basic American principle of equality.